Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shanna Moore and I'm the Training Manager with FASD Network of Saskatchewan. My job at the FASD Network is to oversee the training program as well as deliver training and presentations all over Saskatchewan as well as outside of Saskatchewan and abroad. We also at the FASD Network of Saskatchewan have a full support program. We are a provincial organization, so we can provide supports and services across the province. So if you are an individual who you think potentially could be impacted by FASD, if you're supporting an individual who potentially could be impacted by FASD, or if you're working with a caregiver or you are a caregiver who is caring for someone who has FASD, you can connect with our services. The huge takeaway to the FASD Network of Saskatchewan to our support program is that you do not need a diagnosis to access services, and it's a free service, okay? It's voluntary harm reduction, person-centered, which means when we are going to meet with someone who's looking for supports and services, we're never going to come in and say, this is what you need to do. We're going to say, what do you need help with and how do we help you get there? So once again, to access supports and services through the FASD Network, you do not need a diagnosis. That is not a requirement. There's lots of barriers to getting a diagnosis, so that is not a requirement to accessing services. As well, as I mentioned before, it's free and it's voluntary. You just have to want the help. So when I first started talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I like to talk about statistics because statistics shows how prevalent FASD is in our communities. So right now in Canada, they estimate that 4% of the Canadian population is impacted by FASD. I want to stress that this 4% is not based on diagnosed FASD because FASD often goes undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, so you often get every diagnosis in the book before you get the FASD diagnosis, if you get the FASD diagnosis. The statistic that is based on diagnosed FASD is they say 9 in every 1,000 live births across Canada is impacted by FASD. That statistic is quite dated and quite an underestimate, as I mentioned, because FASD is often going undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Also, when they estimate that 4% of the Canadian population is impacted by FASD, that puts the rates of FASD higher than the rates of autism and higher than the rates of Down syndrome. And yet we continue to be the most significantly underfunded disability in Canada. Lots of people believe that FASD is 100% preventable, and that language has often been used to talk about FASD. But statistics show, as we can see on the screen, that 50% of pregnancies in Canada are unplanned, and 80% of the population drinks. So it brings us to this question, is FASD 100% preventable? Technically, if no alcohol is used during pregnancy, that is correct. You will not have a child that is impacted by FASD. But when we continue to have a high percentage of pregnancies being unplanned and a high percentage of the population who consumes alcohol, we are always going to have individuals who are impacted by FASD in our communities. So I want to stress that we are no longer saying that FASD is 100% preventable. This is a very stigmatizing statement, and we're absolutely 100% moving away from that because of unplanned pregnancies. So it brings us to this next slide. Why do pregnant women drink? Why is alcohol used during pregnancy? Society paints this so black and white. It's so simple. If you know you're pregnant, you don't consume alcohol. And if you do consume alcohol while you're pregnant, the world tells you you're a terrible person, you're a terrible mom. Moms take the brunt of FASD, the stigma, the shame and blame. And what I want to stress is that we need to shift this conversation. We need to have conversations about why alcohol is used during pregnancy, okay? And we need to have safer, more compassionate communities for moms to be able to come forward and say, yeah, you know what, I did consume alcohol. Because when we have the shame and blame focus, it's not safe for moms to come forward. And it's not so black and white as I mentioned. There's so many reasons why alcohol can be used during pregnancy. We have some women who are dealing with addictions. We have some women who are in unsupportive or abusive relationships, right? Some domestic violence, that if they're not partying with their partner, they're beat. And who knows the minute they're pregnant? As we talked about in the previous slide, 50% of pregnancies in Canada are unplanned. 80% of the population consumes alcohol. When we have people saying that, yeah, I stopped drinking when I found out I was pregnant, how far along were they? How much alcohol was used? Research shows that there's no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy. They can't pinpoint if there's a safe amount, a safe time. They do know it can be as little as 2 binge drinking episodes to have a child that is impacted by FASD. And here's the thing, what's considered a binge drink? A binge drink is considered 4 more drinks on one occasion. Lots of people, when I ask that question, they'll be like, oh, it's a 2-day bender or passed out intoxicated. And that's not the case, right? It's 4 more drinks on one occasion. Or here's another piece of the puzzle. Unfortunately, there's still doctors and healthcare professionals out there to this day that do tell pregnant women, it's okay to drink alcohol during pregnancy. It's okay to have a glass of wine. It's okay to drink beer. Okay. And as I mentioned before, the research shows there's no safe amount. There's no safe time. We have women that are dealing with mental health issues and trauma. Okay, and when they're not getting the supports and services that they need, and we know when it comes to mental health supports and services, or supports and services for people dealing with trauma, that we are not meeting the demands out there. And so when we have people that are not getting the supports and services that they so desperately need, self-medication can happen, right? Self-medicating with drugs or alcohol. Or potentially mom could potentially have FASD themselves. And sometimes if they have FASD themselves, that cause and effect piece isn't there, so they might not actually understand that consuming alcohol during pregnancy could potentially harm their unborn baby. What I want to tell you is that there is absolutely no mom out there that drinks on purpose to harm their baby. Every mom wants to have a healthy, happy baby. And I can tell you that we need to shift that conversation. We need compassion, we need understanding, and we need safer, more supportive communities for moms to be able to come forward and say, you know what, yeah, I did use alcohol, and potentially FASD is what's going on with my child. So what is FASD? FASD is called Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, and it's a disability caused by alcohol use during pregnancy. And what happens is alcohol passes freely between mom and baby. Okay? FASD is an incredibly complex disability, and it's incredibly complex because no two people with FASD are impacted the same. So the expression we like to use at the FASD Network is when you've met one individual with FASD, you've met one individual with FASD. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how a FASD might present. And we talk about this in primary disabilities. Primary disabilities are the direct result of the prenatal exposure to alcohol. Okay? The only way to prevent the primary disabilities is not to consume alcohol during pregnancy. But when we talk about primary disabilities, we classify them into 4 different categories: physical, cognitive, behavioral, and sensory. So what we're going to go through now is break this down and what can this present like. The biggest thing that I really, really want to stress is that not every individual with FASD is going to have every single thing that I talk about. Okay, you could be supporting 2 people with FASD who are polar opposites. One person's deficits could be the other person's strengths, and vice versa. One of the other pieces I highly want to stress as well is that everything I talk about, we can put a support and strategy in place, and individuals with FASD can be incredibly successful. First, we're going to talk about physical disabilities. In the past, FASD was referred to as a brain-based disability. I want to tell you this is no longer how we're talking about FASD, but we now are in fact talking about FASD as a full body disorder. Because we know when alcohol is used during pregnancy, it doesn't bypass the baby's body and go straight to the baby's brain. It can impact the whole physical body as well as the baby's brain. So how might this present? So we might see some delayed motor development. This is quite common in infants and toddlers. They might be slower to meet those developmental milestones, slow to learn to crawl, to walk. Problems with fine and gross motor control. Often this is when we notice kids around school age, maybe they're struggling to hold their pencil, their pens, and they need some help there. Poor balance. This is the individual that potentially could be quite clumsy, running into stuff, falling out of their desk at school, tripping into walls, all those different pieces that can happen with poor balance. A lower height or a lower weight. I want to stress that's not always the case for every individual with FASD, but it can be a contributing factor for some people. Auditory impairments, how much are they hearing, right? It's really important. So if you're supporting a 5-year-old with FASD and they're only hearing the last word of everything you say, and you say, don't run, and then they hear run, so they run, and you're like, hey, I told you don't run, and then they run again, and then they're given a consequence for something they didn't understand in the first place, which has a ripple effect into behaviors. Okay, and then we can have poorly developed body systems. So as I mentioned, they're talking about FASD as a full body disorder, so they're starting to see some links between things like maybe heart murmurs, scoliosis, increased ear infections, a whole bunch of different pieces that can be a link, digestive issues to the FASD. So if you're supporting someone who has FASD and they're talking about how their bodies don't feel okay, please check with them, get them to a doctor, and have that conversation about how FASD is now considered a full body disorder, because there definitely could be more going on. So now we're going to talk about cognitive disabilities, and how I like to explain cognitive disabilities is often that stuff that comes easier to us often doesn't come so easy to someone with FASD. I want to stress though, it's not that they can't do anything, right? They sometimes might have to do stuff a little bit differently, and that's okay. So people with FASD can have short-term or long-term memory deficits. This can present like it's there one day, it's there the next, then it's gone, and then it's back again. This is often seen as intentional, purposeful behavior because, maybe it's they forgot their homework or they forgot to do their chore, and there's someone saying, you know what, you did this yesterday, don't tell me you forget, you've done this 3 days in a row, when in fact they might not actually have the memory at that moment. And it's not that they don't have the memory, they don't have the pathway to that memory at that moment. Then we have this word called confabulation. Confabulation is the art of storytelling, right? Often mistaken for lying. So in the world of FASD, what can happen is someone can be telling you something, a story that happened to them. Maybe they're telling you a story about a party they went to, but they got the past 5 parties they went to mixed up. And so out comes a big story of, and you were at the same party as them and you know what they're saying isn't true. Here's the thing, in the world of FASD, if someone is confabulating, they believe what they're telling you is true because that's how it's getting pulled from their memory. People with FASD can also have a slower processing speed. There's a lady in the world of FASD, her name is Diane Malbin, and she's used the expression to describe kids with FASD. She calls them 10-second kids in a 1-second world. Okay, sometimes it just takes them 10, 20, 30, 40 seconds longer to process information around them than the other people, and we just need to give them the time they need to process the information. Sometimes their attention span can be impacted. Impaired executive functioning, it's the ability to self-organize, to predict outcomes, difficulty setting and reaching goals, problems generalizing. What this means is not every individual has the capacity to take what they've learned in one environment and transfer it to another environment. So often what we've seen this is the reteaching of the same skills in new environments all the time. So an example I use is it could be as simple as teaching your child how to cross the street. So you take them outside and you tell them you can only cross the street when it's safe. They have to look both ways, and every time they cross the street in front of their house, they stop and they look both ways and they make sure they only cross when it's safe. Then you go to pick them up from school a couple days later and you're parked across the street from the school and they dart out in front of moving traffic, and you're having a conversation saying, hey, what are you doing? You know how to cross the street. You got to look both ways. You know how to do this. I already taught you this. When in fact you taught them how to cross the street in front of the house, you didn't teach them how to cross the street in front of the school. So you might have to reteach that same skill in new environments all the time. This potentially could go into adulthood as well. People with FASD can have trouble connecting cause and effect. They don't always understand their actions have consequences, so we can see them do the same thing over and over again. Absolutely, they can learn how to make these connections, and there's all kinds of supports and strategies we can put in place to help with all these things that I'm talking about. Poor receptive language skills, people with FASD can present really well, have really fantastic conversations, but sometimes how much they understand is a little bit different. So we gotta constantly check to make sure that they understand. Because if we're having a conversation with someone who's impacted by FASD and they're saying, yeah, I understand, and they actually concretely don't understand, they potentially could get themselves into some trouble. And then when they don't understand and then they're given a consequence for something they don't understand, then we can sometimes see that behavior. In trouble with abstract concepts, people with FASD often are incredibly concrete in how they think. So things like time, money, and math, anything that's really abstract can be a little bit more challenging for someone with FASD. And sometimes people with FASD can have a lower IQ, but I can tell you quite often that's not the case. And often people with FASD, their IQ is just fine. Unfortunately, what happens in the world of supports and services is lots of them are IQ based, And so that can be a hard factor when someone's IQ is okay, but they have all those other everyday challenges. It might be harder to get those supports and services in place, not impossible, but might potentially present some challenges. And I can't stress enough that everything I've talked about, there's supports and strategies we can put in place to help make individuals with FASD successful. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about behavioral disabilities. So I always say if there's one word you take away from FASD, take this word away. It's called dysmaturity. Dysmaturity is very prominent in the world of FASD. And what dysmaturity means, it means when someone's developmental level and physical age don't really match up. In the world of FASD, they're often not matching up, okay? So when you're working or supporting someone with FASD, your expectation always should be to their developmental level, not their physical age. Now, everyone's developmental level compared to their physical age is going to be really unique to the individual that you're supporting. So someone who's 18 might function more like a 12 to 15-year-old, and so you would adjust your expectation down to that. Or it could be someone who's 10 years old who functions more like a 7-year-old, okay? You're going to know where their developmental level is at of the person you're supporting who potentially could be impacted by FASD. So I just can't stress enough to have your expectation to their developmental level, not their physical age. Don't ever tell someone with FASD to act their age, okay? Because developmentally they might not be there. And so when we have problems, when we're experiencing dysmaturity, we can have problems with social skills. We can have a hard time making good friendships, maintaining good friendships, potentially be easily influenced to do stuff maybe that's not okay. We could potentially have trouble with social cues, that's picking up on body language, tone of voices. Impulsivity is big in the world of FASD as well. Mood swings or moods could be all over the place. Sometimes people with FASD can present like emotionless, like they have no emotions, when in fact they do. They just don't have the language to express how they feel. Lack of inhibitions. This is when someone is overly friendly. Maybe it's a child, stranger danger. What's that? Perseveration is when they can hyper-focus on something, so their minds get stuck on something and they have a hard time getting unstuck. They can react poorly to changes in routine. Routine and structure is so incredibly important for someone with FASD. Okay, so when something in the routine or their structure changes for someone with FASD, maybe it's 20 minutes of their day that changed. For them, it's not just 20 minutes of their day. Now it's in fact their whole routine that changed, and now it's a whole routine they have to learn all over again. Poor understanding of ownership. This is when people often mistaken for stealing. This is concrete abstract thinking. So sometimes people with FASD, if nobody is around something, they might take something that doesn't belong to them because to them it's out in the open, it doesn't belong to anyone. As I mentioned, it can be often mistaken for stealing. Hard time regulating emotions, susceptible to peer pressure, easily overwhelmed, and unrealistic expectations. And then we're going to get into more with the next slide when we talk about sensory disabilities. What I want to stress though, in the world of FASD, behavior is a sense of communication, okay? And when we can figure out what they're trying to communicate, we can help prevent that behavior. So everything that is mentioned on this slide, right? There's a support and strategy we can put in place. And when there's stuff going on, they're trying to communicate something. And when we can figure out what they're trying to communicate, we can help set them up for success. Next, we're going to get into sensory disabilities. Sensory disabilities, I could believe, can be the root cause of so many behaviors. They can be the hardest thing to figure out, but sometimes the simplest thing to fix. Okay, so someone with FASD, if they have a sensory piece going, they could be oversensitive or undersensitive or hyposensitive or hypersensitive in all these different categories. So taste, maybe someone with FASD needs a lot of spice in their food to actually be able to taste it. Or it could be the polar opposite, they can't handle any spice in their food. Smell, they could have a heightened sense of smell or a really hard time smelling. If they have a heightened sense of smell, maybe you're working with someone who gets agitated every time they're around you. Maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe it's they can't handle the smell of your hand sanitizer, or they can't handle the smell of your shampoo, or they can't handle the smell of your perfume, your cologne. Touch, some people with FASD crave touch, or they don't like to be touched. Or maybe it's that their clothes need to feel a certain way. Maybe they can't have seams in their socks. Maybe they can't wear blue jeans, maybe only leggings. There's a whole bunch of different pieces how someone could be impacted when it comes to touch. Hearing, you could have a really heightened sense of hearing or a hard time hearing. So heightened sense of hearing, you can imagine there's lots of different environments that maybe wouldn't be sensory friendly for someone with that heightened sense of hearing, such places such as a school gym, maybe even grocery shopping, right? There's lots of noises, and with someone with that heightened sense of hearing, it could potentially cause a behavior. Sight, rooms that are really calm are better than rooms that are really, really busy for someone that has that heightened sight profile. Their proprioception can be impacted. This is where your body is in relation to your surroundings. So in kids, we see them, they often like to be in tight, confined spaces because they feel safe and secure. In adulthood, maybe it's like the blankets pulled really tight, lots of heavy blankets. Your vestibular input can be impacted. This is your movement sensations, so you could be sensory seeking or sensory avoidant. If you're sensory avoidant, maybe being in the car might make you car sick. If you're sensory seeking, you're going to be seeking some type of movement to help you self-regulate. 3 other ones that are not up there that I like to touch on is temperature. Not every individual with FASD interprets temperature the same way we do. So they could be outside on a really, really cold day and not know that it's cold because their body doesn't feel it the same way. Or they could be overdressed when it's really, really hot out. Hunger sensations. Some people with FASD never feel hungry, so if they didn't have reminders and prompts to eat, they may not remember to eat because they don't have that sensation of being hungry. Or it could be the opposite, that they eat and eat and eat because they don't have that sensation of feeling full. And I always say one of the most important ones to be super aware of is how the individual interprets pain. So some people with FASD, maybe they get a paper cut on their finger and they need to go to the hospital and get stitches because it's really, really bad. Or it could be the opposite, that they're walking around on a broken ankle and actually don't know that it's broken because they don't have, how they interpret pain is very different than the rest of us. So I always say just be super cautious if you are working or caring for someone who potentially could have FASD, and if they don't interpret pain the same way we do, they potentially could be really sick or really hurt and actually not know it. And I cannot stress enough, there's all kinds of supports and strategies we can put in place. And if you are supporting someone with FASD, or you're an individual with FASD and you've got some of the sensory processing pieces going on, I can't stress enough the impact that a sensory-based occupational therapist will have. It is one of the best services that you can receive, and there's all different kinds of ways to get in touch with a sensory-based occupational therapist and different funding options out there. And if that's something you need help with, you could absolutely connect with the FASD Network of Saskatchewan, and we can help you with those pieces. Now we're going to get into secondary challenges. Secondary challenges are not the direct result of the prenatal alcohol exposure, but as we kind of chatted about all these different things that can happen in the world of FASD, we can see how some more challenges could happen. They say that secondary challenges can be prevented. Quite often they're not. Even when someone's fully supported, we're still sometimes going to see some of these secondary pieces. So some secondary challenges, we could have mental health issues such as anxiety, depression. FASD is often a co-occurring disability, so if you have an FASD diagnosis, chances are you might have an ADD or an ADHD along with it. Statistics show that about 90% of people who have FASD will have mental health issues at some point in their life. Substance use disorder. There's research that suggests that people with FASD potentially could get a stronger sensation from the use of drugs and alcohol than someone who doesn't have FASD. And so quite often that addiction can come on faster and it can be a little bit harder to kick. A big piece of the puzzle too is quite often addiction treatment facility programs are not being modified for someone with FASD. So sometimes it can be harder for them to be successful within the treatment facility programs. Justice issues, people with FASD can be the victim or the offender. I want to stress though that there's lots of movement in the justice world where we're starting to recognize FASD, and we've got things like mental health courts in place, which is a huge step in the right direction. Education and employment. I would say education is probably the number one secondary challenge for children and youth with FASD, especially if that disability is not recognized. I can tell you they're often given other labels. They're bad, they're lazy, they lie, they cheat, they steal. Quite often, potentially, there could be an underlying disability. And so education can present some challenges if that disability is not recognized, or if there's no one advocating for that child or youth in the education system. Employment, I would say, can people with FASD be employed? Absolutely, 100%. Sometimes it's just as simple as a place of employment, understanding that individual has a disability. Housing and homelessness. So if we're an individual with FASD, potentially we're employed, but maybe we struggle with money management because that's an abstract concept. And so maybe if we don't pay our rent, homelessness can happen. Relationship and friendship issues, that goes back to that dysmaturity piece. Sexuality, healthy sexuality. And parenting with FASD. Can parents with FASD be parents? Absolutely, 100%. And sometimes they just need support and help along the way. But one of the things that I want to stress is that there is not one person in this world that can get through life without support and help along the way. So people with FASD, that support and help, it just looks a little bit different. And that is 100% okay. And once again, I'm going to stress that everything that we've talked about, there's supports and strategies we can put in place to help make individuals with FASD successful. And as we're getting towards the end here, one of the things that I want to stress is that people with FASD 100% can learn. But the people that have to do the most learning are the people that are supporting people that are impacted by FASD. And it's this whole shift that has to happen. It's called this paradigm shift. And this is once again Diane Malbin's chart. And it's this whole shift about how it's seen, not that from seeing they won't to that they can't, right? Is the individual annoying? No, they're frustrated and challenged. Are they lazy? No, they're tired of failing. Are they lying? It's called filling in the blanks. It's called confabulation. It's part of the disability. Are they fussy? Are they oversensitive and they got that sensory piece going on? Are they acting younger? Guess what? They are younger. It's called dysmaturity, and that's 100% okay. Are they attention seeker? Are they attention seeker, or they need that contact and support? Are they inappropriate, or once again they're just displaying behaviors of a child much younger than them or an individual younger than them? And once again, that's called dysmaturity, and it's 100% part of the disability. And when this whole shift can happen, we can help set individuals with FASD up for success. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. So if you would like more information on FASD, we do offer 6 hours of intensive frontline training on FASD, and you connect with us at the FASD Network of Saskatchewan to get more information. All the information can be found on our website. We are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we do have more videos on YouTube. So as I mentioned, please connect with us at any time, and we'd be more than happy to help support you.